when people ask me what I do for work, whether it's custom officers, Airbnb hosts, Uber drivers, I say I prevent euthanasia and encourage hope, and that leads them to share stories with me.
G'day everyone, and welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makowiecki, and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Amanda Achtman. She's a Canadian pro-life activist presently working on an initiative called Dying to Meet You. It's a project of cultural renewal which seeks to humanise our conversations around suffering, death, meaning and hope. Amanda also works with Canadian Physicians for Life on ethics education and cultural engagement. Amanda, welcome to the channel.
Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you. We had some initial troubles getting started, but we finally got there for all of those at home wondering what's happening. So I was hoping you could start by just telling us a bit about yourself, introducing yourself to the audience in case they're not familiar with your work.
Sure. Well, as you said, I started this project called Dying to Meet You. And the first thing a lot of people wonder is, what's a young person doing focused on the issue of euthanasia? And there's an interesting trajectory that led me, I think, to this mission. And I think that's partly the role of my grandfather in my life. I grew up with a really warm relationship with my grandfather, and it's pretty unconventional in Canada, as I'm sure it is for Australia, for intergenerational households. They're not as common as in other parts of the world, but it was a great gift when my grandfather moved in with my family during my high school and university years. And he was a Polish Jewish atheist. So he had come to Canada during just before the Second World War, thankfully. And due to the events surrounding the Holocaust, he had certainly lost his faith, even though he raised my father and my father's twin brother with a sense of kind of Jewish cultural identity. And so he moved in with us, and he was my sort of intellectual sparring partner. We were always having discussions around the dinner table and talking politics and religion. And right around the time that he was in his 90s, and I was in my university studies, the government started talking about legalizing euthanasia for those whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable. And of course, all of our deaths are, in a certain sense, reasonably foreseeable. But particularly living with a 90-year-old who I loved in my life, I realized, oh, this concerns people like him, people who are aging and who are getting very near to the end of life. And also, I realized that there were times where he would have asked for it. For example, I was visiting him in the hospital just a few months before he died, and he was going through a really rough time. And I think it's quite normal for people to say, as they're aging and as they're nearing death, that they want to die. That's actually a rather kind of natural cry of the heart. But what's not natural is for people to capitulate and concede and say, okay, we'll go for it, or I'll support you in that. And so I started to see this, and I really had the sense that this concerns me personally, and that this would threaten people in a moment of weakness, in a particular moment of vulnerability. And I really like how a friend of mine puts it. He says, it's not so much that there are vulnerable people and then everyone else. We all have vulnerable moments in our lives, moments where we struggle, moments of weakness. And so as the government was bringing in euthanasia ostensibly only for those with terminal illnesses and whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable, I got pretty concerned and pretty alarmed. And I've been following it ever since that legalization, which happened in 2016.
You said probably about a decade ago or so that a comment from John Paul II really left an impression on you, which was that socialism's fundamental error is that it gets the human person wrong. And so I was wondering, how important do you think the recovery of a Christian anthropology is for cultural renewal and taking the fight to things like euthanasia?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It was super decisive. So I grew up in this Jewish Catholic family. I actually have 3 out of 4 Jewish grandparents, but I was raised Catholic from the get-go. So a pretty interesting background and lots of formation to kind of forge my character. And that really came together because when I was 18, I went on a Holocaust study trip to Germany and Poland. I traveled with 60 students from all across Canada and with 2 Holocaust survivors. And it was on that trip that one of our guides said that dehumanization is at the core of genocide. And I thought, okay, if dehumanization is the core of genocide, what then does it mean to humanize humanity? And if this fundamental error, as John Paul II puts it in Centesimus Annus, is to get the human person wrong, then who is it and what is it to get the human person right? So those questions so much have gone together, the Holocaust study trip and the study of the church's social teaching, because I became really obsessed and consumed with finding, discovering, and living an antidote to dehumanization in our time through a correct understanding of the human person, because every form of dehumanization gets the human person wrong, proposes solutions or ideas that are inadequate to the human person, whereas the humanization consists in the right understanding and right relationship of persons.
Hmm. Yeah, so I guess to strengthen that understanding of yours, you said you had a Polish connection, and then you enrolled in the John Paul II Philosophical Studies program at the Catholic University. Is it Lublin? Is that how you
Yep.
pronounce it?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So, what motivated you to study there, and what was it like living in Poland?
Well, it was super interesting that I found out about this brand new English language master's program in John Paul II studies about a week after my grandfather died. And I saw that as super providential because he would have been so baffled. It would have completely perplexed him, the idea that his one granddaughter is going to go study and live in what is basically in his mind just a Jewish cemetery with not a lot to gain by being there, and just a lot of horrors to remember. And I didn't quite see it that way, though. Even though I had been on the Holocaust study trip, I always had a very strong sense that Poles were definitely victims of the Nazis, and I was very sensitive to the stories of the righteous among the nations, because in looking for the antidote to dehumanization, I realized the several thousand Polish resistance figures who are also honored as righteous among the nations. And I thought if John Paul II could come from there, if Maximilian Kolbe, his story really captured me, of him giving his life for a prisoner, if these kinds of figures, saints, heroes, and martyrs could come out of Poland, then I thought just steeping in that environment would be very good. And I knew it was a quite Catholic country, and coming from a very secular country of Canada, I thought, oh, this will be good to see what's it like for a culture that has so much more kind of robust tradition and sense of who they are, and kind of a noble patriotism as I saw it. So I didn't totally know what I was in for. My only experience of Poland had really been on that Holocaust study trip. And nevertheless, as soon as I saw this YouTube video promoting the program, it was like God said to me, "Leave your country, go to the land that I will show you. It's Poland." And I just like didn't even tell anyone about it. I kept it kind of secretly confided with God until the very last moment, and I was getting ready to take off and set off to do the 2-year degree program. So I just had this complete confidence that it was the next right step, and it ended up being hugely formative. I absolutely loved being there, and there was so much just kind of redemption in being in so many of those places. I spent a lot of time also volunteering as a guide at a former concentration camp just 15 minutes away from my university. So yeah, very, very significant time.
Yeah. You said that Poland is quite culturally strong. It's had strong faith that might be waning, but traditionally it's been very strongly Catholic and very patriotic. Whereas I feel like in Canada, definitely my own experience in Australia, there's a sense of rootlessness, and one of your comments caught my attention. You said we do not so much have a culture of death as we have death without culture. I was hoping you could expand on that for us.
Sure. Yeah. So, of course, we all know this phrase of the culture of death, and of course know what John Paul II and others have meant by it. But yeah, you're exactly right. In our secular societies, like in Canada and Australia, I think we've lost the touch points that kind of lend significance to the rituals that make life meaningful. And we don't really know what to do with ourselves because of a lack of customs and mores, not only around death and dying, but around relationships, around conventions. It's just so eroded, and we've lacked that sense of sort of social cohesion around a set of yeah, mores and customs, as sort of Tocqueville might talk about it. And so I think that in my travels all around the world, and I really have spent a lot of time traveling the whole world, and especially in the Middle East, and I see in other cultures a real robustness in how these kinds of events of suffering, dying, and grieving are lived. People know what to do. They know how long they spend grieving. They know how to show up for one another. And I look at that with a great admiration. And in fact, I think that especially the immigrant and refugee communities who come to our countries have a lot to teach us with respect to humanizing the culture and rehabilitating some cultural customs for ourselves. So I'm always trying to look, including within our country, to those who are from different cultural traditions, and to glean best practices, or to at least admire and let those facets that are admirable take root in moral imagination here.
Mhm. Yeah. Another question I've got is whenever euthanasia or assisted dying or any of the various terms they give to this sort of thing is going to be introduced, the proponents are always saying it's going to be very strict and you have to be suffering from a terminal condition and you'll need multiple doctors. And yet we find in Canada, as in Australia, as in Belgium and the Netherlands, it didn't take long to extend access to those with a disability or mental illness. I mean, that might not be Australia quite yet, but you can see it on the horizon. And I'm wondering, why do you think the eugenic tendency is so strong as soon as it's unleashed, and where does it end?
hmm Well, I think part of it is it's this inability to contend with the mystery of suffering. And so suffering is then regarded as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be lived. And that's why eugenics and euthanasia are two sides of the same coin. So with uh like it's just so interesting how there's a correlation, and we see the same thing at the beginning and end of life, that when there are some lives that can easily be disregarded, dismissed, or discounted, whenever there's some kind of criteria that renders people capable of being discarded, then that implies a social valuation on life. So it's never a pure individual autonomous decision, because the fact of having criteria itself indicates that some lives are more worthwhile than others. So, for example, if 9 out of 10 people with a certain condition, let's say ALS, decide to ask for euthanasia freely of their own volition, ostensibly, asking for it in freedom and uncoerced, let's say, well, that one person who isn't asking for it, how is that person to be made to feel? Will the doctors really fight for him or her? And what is the signal? What is the message that it sends if people with this condition are being euthanized? In Canada, the majority of people being euthanized so far still have terminal cancer as their underlying diagnosis. Well, what does that say to all cancer patients? It makes cancer so much more threatening, so much more terrifying than it needs to be when people are more and more often being given up on, being suggested, well, you could apply for euthanasia, just to have that suggested itself already kills the person, deflates them, defeats their sense of confidence. So I see that as wreaking a lot of havoc on our social life, and that's just the point I want to keep making, is that to have a criteria is social in nature. It is never purely libertarian or individual. The fact of having criteria turns it into a social matter.
Hmm. Yeah, one thing that's kind of occupied my thinking is the demographic decline that's occurring throughout the world, particularly across the West, with an aging populations and shrinking tax bases. And it occurs to me, well, if euthanasia is normative, then sooner or later, the solution to the problem, let's say, could well be euthanasia, involuntary, where it's no longer a matter of you being even sick. It's a matter of you reaching a certain age in which you're not considered a productive member of society, which is a really scary prospect. Have you ever kind of followed that logic?
Yeah, so in Canada, even a couple years ago already, the government created it was the parliamentary budget officer that released a report on the total estimated cost savings of MAiD, medical aid in dying. And so already early on into the legislation, there was a whole entire calculation of cost savings through this. That's very sinister, but of course the government is looking for uh, savings, and it's very expensive to provide what people need at the end of life, or for persons with disabilities. Like this is expensive, but people are worth it. They're worth care. They're not just items to be put into a budget of cost savings. The economy is to serve people, not the other way around. And so I actually think that it's a very dystopian, and it's a very callous economic outlook that isn't actually that doesn't really have anything to do with a strong economy. In fact, I would argue, and I'm looking at kind of deepening my economic reflection on this point, that there are economic arguments to be made against euthanasia. Because just think about it. Think about all of the innovation and entrepreneurship that gets stifled by not looking for cures, by not looking for disability aids, by not improving palliative care, by not doing discoveries that address chronic pain. All of these things, like all of these challenges, demand human solutions, not capitulating and conceding immediately to death. And we actually not only short circuit opportunities to love, but we also shortchange ourselves on the kind of development and advancements technologically and entrepreneurially that are possible when we have a much more audacious approach. And I really believe that a free market perspective is needed, that will actually show that when we look at these issues, the world is not just a matter of scarcity, but that we can, like, just like with people in the past arguing about overpopulation, there were people saying the world's overpopulated, we can't possibly sustain this number of people. Well, that's definitely bogus. Like, with the right innovation and development, we know that we're capable of meeting the needs of more and more people than previous generations could have ever dreamed. And it's the same with this. When we rise to the occasion, when we put demands on ourselves and we don't settle, we're very, very capable of doing so much more.
Yeah. You've seen the College of Surgeons and Physicians in Ontario wanted to remove any mention of medically assisted dying on the death certificates. Have they succeeded in that, or do they look like they'll succeed?
Yeah, very, very much so. The College of Physicians and Surgeons has instructed that doctors list something else, list the underlying condition as the cause of death. And that's basically falsifying death certificates. So people's death certificates are saying things like frailty, when really they're being euthanized, or it's listing cancer, or even dementia, or like, it's very strange. But somehow we still have statistics because there are still some kinds of reporting to the coroner's office of the euthanasia deaths. So even as the death certificates are falsified, the euthanasia deaths are still somewhat being reported, which is how we know that euthanasia accounts for 4.1% of all deaths nationwide in Canada. In parts of the country, euthanasia is accounting for 7 to 8% of all deaths. So now this is touching everyone, to the extent that there's not really a day that I go and speak somewhere where people don't tell me a personal story of someone they know who has been euthanized or who's thinking about it. It's really starting to touch more and more people. And just to put into perspective, the astronomical rates of euthanasia in Canada, more Canadians have been killed by doctors and nurses, because nurses can do it too, in hospitals, homes, and even national parks. Our government advertises you could receive euthanasia in a national park. More Canadians have been killed by doctors and nurses in hospitals, homes, and national parks since 2016 than the total number of Canadians who have died of COVID to date. And those are comparing the government's own numbers for both. So I think that's really shocking, because we've had nowhere near the public outcry or response to this euthanasia crisis. And as with you and over there in Australia, we had an extremely, extremely severe COVID response. And I think it just shows the disproportionate perspective when death seems like it's out of control versus when it can be controlled and managed. So yeah, something to watch out for. For sure.
It's an interesting insight, isn't it? The need for control. That's an underlying thing, both in the decision to kind of access this, but also the authorities' part to administer it. Yeah, very interesting. So your conversation is geared towards hope, and I've noticed I've been asking quite a few negative questions in terms of like how bad is it, and how bad can it get. One more of those, and then we'll get onto some, I suppose, hopeful, positive things. Okay, so why do we in the West seem so averse to death on the one hand, and yet so keen to embrace it on the other? It strikes me as a bit strange.
Well, I think that, again, to the point of control, uh, there's this desire to hold everything in control, and death, like suffering, is a big mystery, and it's something that no amount of preparation. I was just reading on Twitter, a disability activist wrote, like, don't be conceited. Don't think that you can just avoid that you'll never have a disability, that you'll never have a chronic illness. They said, we thought that too until it happened to us, or something like this. And there's this kind of like self-protection that people think they can withstand all these vicissitudes of life if they just plan well or put their things in order. No, it's not like that. We can all suffer things. No matter how much you've set up your life, even with good relationships or good studies, good work, all of that very well. But in the end, we will all suffer something and we will all die. And there's just a real lack of preparedness for that. I mean, we're constantly asking young people, what are you going to do? Who are you going to be? We don't really ask questions that lend themselves to how are you forging yourself to contend with the yet unknown crosses that you will have to bear. Where are those kinds of questions? So when I speak to young people, sometimes I talk about how we're always asked to consider our strengths, but what about also considering our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities? And what if our mission in the world is actually where our suffering and weakness and vulnerability intersects with the needs of the world? And what if what is difficult for us, rather than what comes easy to us, is actually the basis for our insight about what we're called to do? So I just think it's this like different way of questioning and different line of thinking. We can be very individualistic in our societies. We can be very kind of, again, just focused on protecting ourselves rather than that more kind of risk taking to go out of ourselves So yeah, those are just some reflections. And then when death is imminent, or when it's looming on the horizon, then people want to manage it like they've managed everything else. And so euthanasia is kind of death in a social media age, because people can curate a kind of filtered death where the person is drinking champagne and the Spotify playlist is going and everything. It seems to map on. But honestly, if people really reflect on their lives, then probably they can think about a time, hopefully, they can think about a time of great intimacy and closeness, a moment that was so tender and intimate that you wouldn't have wanted to live stream it, or you wouldn't have wanted to even photograph it, because it was just so poignant and you were present and you were completely in it. I think absent those kinds of experiences, then we're not quite trained in the humanity we need to meet our own suffering and death uh, with a kind of resilient fortitude.
Hmm. So this brings us to your Dying to Meet You project. You have spoken a little bit about it. Are there some stories you can share with us that bring hope and show the meaning in death for us?
Yeah, definitely. So what I did on January 1st, 2021, is I made a New Year's resolution to blog about death and dying every day for an entire year, which I did. That was at dyingtomeetyou.ca, so that's the old archived version of my site. And I didn't really write about euthanasia at all. And all of the sites were already oriented toward hope. They were dealing with death and these topics in a kind of cultural light, and I found that so exhilarating. I got a lot of life and energy from it. I loved the interviews I was having with people. I loved going through my camera roll and looking at the places I had visited, and then blogging about end of life topics and in that light. And basically, since then, I've decided to take Dying to Meet You to the next level. And now it's become this broader cultural project where I make short films, I travel across Canada, writing and speaking and organizing local pop up style events, and really releasing these little narrative vignettes. I just released a short film on Monday of this past week, actually, of a man named Roger. He's been in the hospital for some years because of inadequate and negligent home care, and he's actually been injured in home care, and some really awful stories, and he touches on those. And he also shares about how he was offered euthanasia multiple times, and the toll that it takes on him as a patient living with disabilities to have it raised to him when he is fighting for the supports he needs to live. Now, that might sound like a very somber and sad story, and there are parts of it that is, but going and spending time with him, hearing his story, producing the short film, actually all of that is a lot of fun and very, very uplifting. Getting to know him, doing advocacy together. He just sent me a message this morning. The video is doing very, very well on Twitter, and he's thrilled. He's so uplifted. To me, that's just amazing. Like, the fact that it made him very happy to see his story told in a professional, compelling way, that is so uplifting to me. I have stories all the time, every day, with people about euthanasia, because everywhere I go, when people ask me what I do for work, whether it's custom officers, Airbnb hosts, Uber drivers, I say I prevent euthanasia and encourage hope. And that leads them to share stories with me. Like, I had an Uber driver recently, and when I told him that I prevent euthanasia and encourage hope, after he asked me what I do for work, he said, well, my dad received MAiD, again, medical aid in dying, not even a year ago, he said. And he said, I was supportive of it. My dad wanted it, and my mom was there, and my brother was there, and we had it in our family living room, and he had stage 4 cancer, and so it seemed like a sort of ideal circumstance for it, as he thought. And so he said he and his family were supportive, but he said, now, though, I have to tell you that it is the most effed up thing in the world when you know that your father is going to die in 7 days, then 5 days, then 3 days, then in 15 minutes. And he also shared that his mother can't go in the living room anymore. She's very, very affected by it, that he has become very shaken in ways he didn't expect. And he ended our ride, sharing with me how he hadn't told anyone about this. He hadn't had any occasion to talk about it since then. I was just shocked. Here he is sharing it with an Uber passenger. He told me not to give him a low rating. I'm like, I'm not going to give you a low rating for sharing your story with me. Like, thank you for talking to me. And yeah, so people have so many stories. Like, I'm seeing the toll that this is taking on friends and family members. It's like wreaking a really complicated grief in people's lives. But at the same time, again, what energizes me and gives me so much hope is that people are really hungry to talk about suffering, death, meaning, and hope. It awakens people to the topics of significance. And I love this quotation that significance is meaning that has been toughened by the consciousness of our finitude. Significance is the meaning that is toughened by our awareness of our own mortality. And so, as someone who's hungry for meaning and depth and like the weightiness of what it means to be human, I find it super uplifting to talk about these topics of ultimate significance with people, because contending with it, it just makes people come alive. Like, especially when I speak about death with young people, they so want to talk about it. They actually find that it clarifies their discernment, that it's honestly kind of relaxing when you think about how um, the shortness of your life, it helps you to clarify and focus and to not be so grasping and acquisitive, but to just realize, how do I live a life that matters? How do I do good deeds each day? How do I show kindness? How do I let every interaction be a little bit of light in the world, rather than thinking that our lives are infinite and we have, I mean, our lives on this earth are infinite and we can just do things later or put things off. There, like, I think especially what young people love about thinking about death is that it instills a kind of moral urgency and value to life. And honestly, all these things just make it very, like, people ask if it's hard for me. It's actually very like good for me. I love it. I honestly love it.
Mhm. Yeah, there's for a lot of people, it's hard to imagine you can have a beautiful death even amidst suffering. And I've seen it a couple of times in my life. And when you were talking, about positive things coming out of these situations, I remember a time I was volunteering with a missionary order in Ethiopia, and part of their compound, let's say, they had an AIDS hospice. And so I went in there one day because I was mainly there to teach English, and I just went in there one day, and I heard a guy with the death rattle, which those who aren't familiar with it, it's a sign of impending death. And I knew about it because I'd seen my grandfather have that when he died in 1997. And so I went to sit next to his bed and hold his hand. And the staff in there was a lay worker in there, and he gestured to me to not do it because he seemed to think that AIDS was contagious. But of course, I knew better, and so I held his hand and I stroked his hair as I heard this breathing, and within 3 minutes he was gone. And I'm convinced it was God working to show this guy that no matter what a horrible life you had, you just needed an expression of love, and once he'd received it, he could let go.
Wow.
And everyone else, though, if you're objectively looking, you say, yeah, he's MAiD, or he's euthanasia, he's suffering, take him out of it. But there was he needed to hold on so that another human being could show him what he needed to be an instrument. And so, yeah, anyway, that's my own anecdote.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. And it brings to bear a few things. Like, first, the person's death is not only their own, it also concerns you or whoever might be present. And so we don't want to miss out on those opportunities of the way in which a dying person, can be a gift for others. A friend of mine whose son died of cancer at 18 has this incredibly beautiful photo of the son's buddies all gathered around the bedside in the days before he dies. And what Marcus, who was dying, did is he had a word for each of his buddies. So these 18-year-old, 17, 18-year-old guys, and he addressed each one personally with what I think of as a kind of deathbed authority that a person only has when they are suffering and dying naturally. They command a sort of authority. There's a weightiness, there's a capacity to instill words that hold your heart and like will stay with you forever. And the way that each of those young guys is leaning in to hear every word that he has for them, and the fact that what he's capable of delivering is so much more poignant, is so much more serious than any other word he was able to give throughout his life. I think that's immensely, immensely powerful. And the suffering and dying person always remains a recruiter of acts of kindness and of the attention of others, if we're willing to pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an interesting thing you come across in YouTube. I mean, I don't search out kind of people experiencing terminal cancer, but you do see people's diaries that they keep. And also, I remember seeing this beautiful young woman. She was on, I think, America's Got Talent or Britain's Got Talent, and she had terminal cancer. But it was an extraordinary witness because she was approaching it with this beautiful smile, and it pulls the heartstrings. But you know, the work that you're doing, and in a sense what they're doing as well, approaching death with some sense of serenity, and accepting it's a part of life, is something. Yeah, obviously, hope instills hope in people, to show that there's a much better way than sticking an injection in people's arm, because they've
And
become
imagine what we would have missed. Like, I think you're talking about Nightbirde, who is a huge
absolutely, yeah, that's
inspiration,
her, yeah.
beautiful, beautiful, beautiful audition, and who inspired so many people. There are still acts going on the show. I think there was a large African children's choir that did a spin on one of her songs and showed up to the show and did very well. And so the way that her witness and her spirit reverberates even after her death in countless ways. She would have certainly qualified for euthanasia even before that audition had she said she was suffering intolerably in Canada. So imagine the impact. And we never know when we will make our greatest impact. We never, ever know what God has in store for us in terms of ultimate kind of destiny. And there's so many lines that she said, even in that audition, that that are just amazing. Like she says, you can't wait until life isn't hard anymore until you decide to be happy. And she has this credibility because of her vulnerability. And we need the stories and the witness of people in their vulnerability to humanize the culture. And that's really what happens with the incarnation. God comes to earth and has this vulnerability through which he has authority and credibility because of coming alongside and suffering and dying too. If he didn't suffer and die, people might have been able to say, like, really, you don't understand the human condition. But there's this radical solidarity, and we too need to kind of have that solidarity in our day-to-day life, that we always come alongside and say to people, what are you going through? What do you need right now? Not just in dying moments, but anytime. Like, we see someone on the side of the street who needs a glass of water. We see someone who, like, anything that draws us out of ourself, that shakes us out of our inward look, and brings us to have a more generous gaze toward others.
Yeah, you've also said that in the Canadian government's own statistics, people cite a loss of an ability to engage in meaningful activity as their primary reason for accessing MAiD. And so, in a sense, it's an existential pain and suffering rather than a physiological one. what are some of the practical things people can do to help others who are suffering in this category?
Yeah, I love that question, and I love that the government has this data actually on ranking the kinds of suffering that people say, by their own admission, the actual people who are asking for euthanasia, what kinds of suffering leads to those requests. And you're right, it's the inability to engage in meaningful activities is the most rated form of suffering that people give. And I think if we take that to heart, which we ought to, recognizing the existential cry of the heart, what we can do is we can do meaningful activities with people nearing the end of life. What are meaningful activities? Well, I think, like you just described, a beautiful one of holding that man's hand as he was dying. There are things we can do a little bit sooner, too, with people as they're in the hospital, as they're undergoing treatments. Like, if the problem is a crisis of meaning, then it's incumbent, especially on people who value life, who consider themselves pro-life or Christian, or want to kind of live out their values in a certain sense. Go and have meaningful activities with people who are the most neglected, discarded, discounted. Like, not just, it's kind of like the gospel says, don't just like throw a banquet for your friends, but invite the poor, the crippled, the lame. Well, what is that today? Like, don't just go visit uh, your parent in the hospital who's going through cancer treatment. Find the one who has no family and bring them a meal. Invite the person with mental illness who's alone at a holiday to come to your home for a dinner. Like, what is our contemporary version of all of those things that make demands on us, but that really help humanize the culture and build a concrete resistance to this temptation, which is really a temptation to suicide ultimately.
Hmm. Yeah, they talk about the epidemic of loneliness as well. And in a sense, it's hidden because a lot of the people who are suffering are in their houses or in their apartments. Um, and Mother Teresa, I think, identified this as at the heart of the West's own poverty. And so I suppose seeking out the lonely, because those who have no one, and this is kind of become increasingly prevalent when there are fewer children around, etc. Uh, that I think the Christian thing to do is to see that that's a massive problem. That and home visitation is we really got to lift our game on that if we're to be pro-life in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, because you want to treat the symptoms or the causes rather that lead to this desire to take one's own life. Um,
Yeah, definitely.
yeah. So on a, I think on a changing tack, you moved to Rome to do some more study, and you have this very interesting subject, which is studying the resurrection of the dead in Jewish thought. And so I was wondering what interested you in this subject and what you've learned.
Well, first of all, it's quite related, I think, actually, to everything. I see it now as a very continuous thread that God is weaving through the course of my life. At the time that I was also working with a member of parliament to try and prevent the legislative expansion of euthanasia on the basis of disability and mental illness, after that kind of had wrapped up and um, the law was passed, unfortunately, but we did our utmost to prevent it. And that was really what I was on Parliament Hill to do. I was looking and praying for the next right thing, and I saw a Facebook ad that said, "Do you want to study Jewish Christian relations in Rome?" And I thought, wow, it's so nice of them to create a grad program that's a perfect biographical match for someone raised in a Jewish Catholic family to go study in Rome with priests and rabbis. And so I applied and quickly discerned to go and do that. I had an amazing 2 years in Rome, and I even before I left for the program, I basically prayed and like saw this whole thesis outline come to mind of resurrection in Jewish thought specifically, and the impact of whether or not we believe in bodily resurrection to our bioethics. And so that's what I was exploring, and it was a total blast. I really liked learning about how strong the belief in the resurrection of the dead is in Judaism, but I think it kind of gets suppressed over the centuries out of a kind of anti-Christian polemic, or because it's becomes to be seen as so core as it is to Christian teaching and Christian faith. But it's right there, and it's a long-standing Orthodox traditional mainstream Jewish belief to believe in the resurrection of the dead, and that this is important for understanding who God is, his character, and ultimate vindication of the God of life, and also for his ultimate destiny for human beings, that we would be able to have this unity of body and soul, that the soul is not only immortal, but that the body also will be raised. And if we sever those, then we kind of become dualists, and having a dualistic anthropology is a problem in this life and in the afterlife. So I was studying that, and I also really liked how I'd come across rabbis, for example, one rabbi who said that not believing that death is the end of the story is the basis for all life affirmation. Not believing that death is the ultimate end of the story is actually the basis for affirming life. And I believe that's so true, because some people would say, oh, well, who cares? Like euthanasia, you're just like, if you believe in eternal life, like just bring it on. Like what difference does it make? But actually there's a real necessity to have a reverence for life in this world, oriented toward the reverence that we have for God and the hope we have for eternal life. So what I liked is that it was very, it was just a joy to study and to think about. Like, it's not the kind of thing that's syllogistic or that's very like axiomatic, but it's something that just fires up your prayer and fires up your wonder. And living in Rome was the perfect place to do it.
Awesome. All right. Is there one last thing? Is there any way people watching can support your work?
Yeah, so check out my website, dyingtomeetyou.com. There you can see the short films I've created, some other podcasts and articles, and anyone can reach out to me through that website. So take a look. Everything's available at dyingtomeetyou.com.
Excellent. And for those who want to help the Thomas More Center, if you could subscribe to this channel, we'd really appreciate it, as we're trying to grow, and of course share this content far and wide, especially to people who might be struggling with these issues. If they have an existential crisis, if they're feeling discarded or unwanted, they need to hear positive messages, and that there are people out there who want them to hang on and to find true meaning in their life for as long as they're with us. So after this video, head on over and check out the Nightbirde video. It's a beautiful thing. Might bring a tear to your eye. But Amanda Achtman, thank you very much for your time, and all the best with your work.
Thank you.